Record. So today is January 22nd, 2025. And I was remembering when I was going to mounds and in Florida that are part of state archaeological parks, and also just state parks, even if they're not archaeological, that the experience of being at these mounds, even if I couldn't actually, be really close to them, which sometimes you want to be a little bit prepared and cautious when you go to sacred sites, not scared, just prepared and respectful and cautious, because these are places that are almost like you would imagine, much in the way you would revere a cemetery next to a church. These are where people's spirits are laid to rest. So here in Florida, I'm obviously not Native American, but I was able to have some profound non-visual experiences. In other words, not, seeing and sensing things that were very hard to describe because they're not in 3D, they're not in the physical realm, they're not things that I can show people without telling them about it. But, sometimes when you go to certain places that have maybe been preserved in a way that is at least mildly respectful, you can have a somewhat mystical experience. And I think in the North American continent, this would be mostly at, especially if you're in a state that, let's just say in the United States, if you're in a state that is maybe doesn't have as much of the Native American population as other states, because that's very true, for unfortunate and horribly traumatic and genocidal reasons. But irregardless, a lot of these state parks or, county parks and whatnot that are near actual mounds, you know, uh, will hold a lot of this mystical energy and such. So I'm just trying to tell you about what got me to want to go to these places in the first place. I think if I hadn't been in some kind of traumatic state at the time, I probably wouldn't have been as, maybe I would have been interested, but I don't think I would have been as on purpose to go to these places, because I think I knew, um, maybe intuitively, that by going into nature, and not just going into any part of nature, because there's so many different levels of, interaction and healing and guidance and various different things that you can get in different areas of nature, because not all nature is the same, um, but I think I knew that, maybe intuitively, that these mounds, would be very intense. And of course, I had heard from my sister; she had had some profound experiences as well, and we went there, kind of on purpose. Uh, I should say on a purpose and with purpose, um, to not only seek healing, but also any kind of guidance that could help me with my situation at the time, which was, as I was saying in earlier videos and chapters, I don't like talking about this a lot, but I'm going to force myself to talk about it a little bit, because I think you have to know a little bit about what's going on. I think if I had to sum up what was going on with me at the time when I, was going through this, it was a combination of psychic attack, probably having my energetic fields been run down a bit by overexertion, which therefore on a physiological and energetic level leads one to, if you're an empath, to kind of take on energies that you shouldn't be taking on. Um, and I think there was other things happening too at the same time, old traumas, after years and years and years of being around not just toxic people, but like being taught to take on their energy, being taught to kind of be manipulated by their energy, and by themselves, and to not really follow my own guidance, which I think was really coming to the forefront at the same time that I was being kind of, I mean, attack's a strong word, but that's kind of what it felt like. Um, and really, there wasn't a specific person verbally doing this to me at the time. It was actually a series of foreign energies that had somehow gotten into my body or onto my body at some point, and I picked them up. And I'm sure I decided that they were mine to pick up for some reason. Um, I think people who have been through a lot of trauma and who have been through living with people, whether they're family members, especially parents who are very powerful people when you're young, they say things, they do things, they repeat behaviors over and over and over when you're very young and impressionable. Obviously, when you're, an infant and 1, 2, 3 years old and you don't have a choice. When you get older, you have a choice. But sometimes we're so brainwashed by that time that we don't realize, that we need to make a choice to do something that's healthy for us. I think there's a lot of people in mental health and wellness, who deal with depression and alcoholism and various addictive behaviors and, physical abuse and other kinds of abuse, who recognize the need for talk therapy, and those are all really excellent things to do. But for some reason, after I'd say maybe 20 years off and on of going to therapists, I mean, I wasn't consistently going to them every year for 20 years, but I had certainly been to enough cognitive therapists after, by the time I got to age 30, 37, I think I was when this was happening. No, I was 30. Yeah, 37. So roughly, I mean, I had had things like this happen to me before that age, but I think it really kind of majorly started kind of culminating at age 36, 37, 38, around there. And for a good 3 years before I ever even had the opportunity to either learn or study about any kind of traditional wisdom, all I had was, well, I was quite lucky actually. I had my sister who had already been trained in Andean mysticism, so she was doing healings on me. And I had gone to one other Andean practitioner like years before that, but I only got to see him once. And sometimes when you have a major, major problem that's multi-layered, it requires more than one visit to somebody. Um, as anybody with a chronic illness or chronic, any chronic condition will tell you, it requires years sometimes of, constant follow-up. So anyway, what I'm getting at right now is sometimes before you find whatever works for you, whatever that is, and for me, it's not one thing. I need 3 and 4 and 5 things sometimes, consistently over a period of time. But at the time, I only had an instinct, and I was very, very lucky to have people in my life who knew traditions to some extent, and were able to heal me to, short term for sure. And this is way before I ever got to go on a trip to Peru and experience, uh, kind of a succinct package program of healing, of traditional wisdom. So for a good 3 years, what I had was going to places like mounds, which I was very lucky, and still am very lucky to live in Florida, and just instinctively go to these places, feel the energy, ask for help from non non-visible to the naked eye energy. Maybe it was while I was in front of a tree, or maybe it was while I was in a wooded area, or maybe perhaps it was when I was near the water, or it could just be on a patch of grass somewhere that just felt really connected. That was all I had at that time. Now I did have other tools. I had kind of a basic understanding of sacred smoke, in terms of, like, just I just knew intuitively that smudging, like I mentioned in another video, that I won't say smudging because I know everybody's talking about how we shouldn't use that word smudging. Uh, sweeping motion of sacred smoke down the, I think in Europe they call it seining, uh, you know, down the body to whisk away kind of negative energy. Or in the Andeans would call it heavy energy. And I mentioned that in another video. Because I think there's a tendency to kind of attach kind of judgmental kind of positive and negative. I guess what I mean by positive and negative is one kind of energy that feels kind of restrictive and heavy versus another kind of energy which feels more lightened, and where you feel expanded and healthy, and you know full of joy and stuff like that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with like positive and negative. It's more of like a light and heavy. Um, so in the meantime, I had things like stones on my body, like I mentioned before, and I had smoke that I was, but remember, I was a smoker, but I didn't know anything about sacred tobacco at this point. So I wasn't doing any kind of like prayers with sacred tobacco. I had no knowledge of that. I didn't feel intuitively like I was going to do that. I didn't even know what that was. Didn't know, didn't know, just didn't know. And so I had to get through 3 years without the tools that I have now. And it was hard. I tried a lot of things. I tried these kinds of herbal baths with different kinds of essential oils, and some of them were kind of like a little harsh. I tried, like I said, the kind of sacred smoke, and that was nice. That helped a little bit. The one thing I did actually, I should have picked up on this early. Like, hindsight is 2020, but I should have picked up on this. I was always getting these Cuban tobacco candles. They made them at this gift shop that I went to, that I was always going to. I was always going to this gift shop because they had crystals and stones, and they had some traditional things there that you could buy. Of course, they were in a gift shop, so I mean, how traditional could they be? But they were helpful. Salt lamps, I think, very, very helpful. The kind of lamp that you can light up. It's an electric lamp, and it's got like a Himalayan salt, very helpful, because Himalayan salt is very helpful. Now I know this. Back then, I didn't know that. I just knew I felt better. I was just looking to feel better. And, but like I said, the Cuban tobacco flavored, it was like I think it wasn't flavored, but it was like the essential oil, maybe, of a candle with Cuban tobacco in it. And for some reason, when I burned those in my room, I just felt better. And, I should have known, like now I can look back and go, you know what? That makes sense because I ended up getting into learning about sacred tobacco. But at the time, I had no idea. I just knew I felt better. So, and sure enough, tobacco is known as a very good cleanser of heavy energy. I mentioned in another video that sage is a cleanser of heavy energy. Salt can help purify the body. A lot of people know about salt being kind of a purifier because it's just used in a lot of different ways. And so I wasn't really doing anything traditional, and that's okay. And to be honest, right now, all these years later, I do some traditional stuff, but I think I do a mixture of things I've learned from traditions and then adapt them into what works for me and for my clients and future students and current students. Because I've found, because I'm a person who has, up until this point, maybe that will change in the future, but chronic health conditions, chronic pain conditions, chronic, you know, issues that, don't seem to go away with one visit to the doctor, um, or even two or three visits. They're just ongoing. That I just need a bigger variety, a more diverse menu, if you will, of different traditions, and not just traditions, because I'm making it sound like it's very, old school, even techniques, So I'm very open to mentally thinking that a person is not necessarily going to find one thing that works for them. And the reason I'm bringing that up today is I think that this idea of all or nothing um, kind of limits people in the Western world. So, sure, you want to make sure that, whatever techniques or traditions you learn are being taught in a way that's safe, that encourage a person to have protection and to make offerings, as I've stated before, but there should be some overlap between various ways of thinking as well, so that they're not forcing you to choose something over something else. Because at the end of the day, I have found that I can't put all my eggs into one basket with traditions or techniques. I can't put everything and say, this one way of doing things is going to solve all of my problems. It's just never worked for me like that. And I think that the majority of people, let's say 2/3, if I could just make up a number, I don't have evidence for this, but I'm just going to make up a number. I think that over half to 2/3 of the people are like myself too, in that I think people's problems are more complicated than that, where they can't necessarily always go to one thing and say, this is going to take care of, you know, almost all of my problems. It's going to depend on a lot of factors. So I think it's important to go ahead, learn traditions. Obviously, if you're lucky enough to go to a beautiful place like these mountains behind me, sure, I got to go to the mountains. That was almost 15 years ago. It was 14 years ago. I haven't been back since. Um, do you go to the mountains and then forget about it when you come home and forget what you've learned? I hope not. I hope that if you do get some training somewhere, that you come back to your house or your apartment or your whatever and continue to learn and grow and heal, especially your environment, because that's something that I'm interested in. But, if you decide to heal other people, you're going to have to eventually come back to your house, which isn't in these faraway places. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to have to like adapt something from what we learned in another location to our current location, which requires more of an open-minded way of thinking of things. So, you have to kind of let your mind kind of be a little more flexible than maybe our current culture would let you do normally, because I'm seeing a lot of, and I want to get into some indigenous principles here because I want to kind of get into that to reiterate what those things are. But I'm seeing a lot of current talk and chatter on the internet, various social media places where people are very experienced in shamanism or animism or various traditions. Maybe some are from, you know, the east side of the world, maybe some are from the west side of the world, north, south, doesn't matter. And it seems like in certain circles, I'm not naming any names or pointing out any traditions, people from those traditions, but it seems like there's a certain amount of people online who have a similar attitude about their tradition as, let's say, the Christian church would, some of the Christian church, let's say. What do I mean by that? Well, some of the Christian church, not all, just some, think that you have to choose their way or nothing at all. There's one way or you're not with us. You're either with us or not with us. That kind of duality where you have to make people choose kind of like allegiance, pledge allegiance to, I think it's a little bit dangerous when you kind of take that kind of mentality into another area like shamanism and animism. I think it shows how conditioned we are by the thousands of years of the church. Well, almost thousands. Well, yeah, no, thousands. It's been at least almost 2,000 years. So that's quite a bit. That's quite a bit of trauma to go through. And where we kind of act like, as a society or as a culture, Western culture, even if we're doing things like shamanism and animism that seem very folkloric and very, some people call it woo woo. But guess what? Some of this stuff is like thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, really old. So I don't know how woo woo it is. If it's a lot older than, organized religion. So there I go. But anyway, my point is that I think when you apply a certain way of thinking that's very duality based, all or nothing, black and white, one way or the other way, and we have to put all of our eggs into one basket over here and abandon everything over here. That's not healthy in this context. I think maybe in other contexts it might be useful. But I think when you're talking about a multiplicity of different cultures and traditions and folkloric, animistic, connecting to the land and the mountains and the water and the nature, spirits, and they have many names in depending on what geography you're in, but they're all valid. Just because one person in one continent practices one way doesn't negate a person in another continent practicing their own way. They may have different names for them. And really, what I get really excited about in a positive way is seeing where they match up. They may have different names, but they're almost doing similar things. And I'd like to tell you kind of like my own story with that. It's a little anecdote. It's not too long. Like I mentioned, I went to Peru, in 11. So that was about 14 years ago. And I had an amazing experience. I was with, my sister and I were with, and my brother in law as well. We all went on a trip with our doctor, who is very, he at the time he was well, he still is an author, and also as well as a doctor and ethnographer, has lived with traditional people pretty much his entire adult life. Uh, so like, you know, 40 plus years, um, if not longer than that. And so he's always worked with very traditional people, no matter where he goes, in the world. And so he was able to show us and introduce us to some very traditional Andean Karo healers. And we received, you know, uh, healing from them. Now, this is hugely profound, and, I could go into that more later. I came home and I was already having some health issues before that, obviously. And after a few more trips that I made to various places just for travel, um, I had some illness happen. And it was, luckily it didn't last longer than a year and a half. And thankfully, I'm doing much better now. But I still have chronic health problems that are significant. But at the time when this happened, I was, back home here, and I was like, a couple of years had passed by, and I was working with my MISA, which is something I'm so fortunate to have it still. Thank God I have it. Um, it's my only connection to the Andean cosmology that's physical and tangible. I can pick it up and feel it, And sometimes when I'm holding it, I think, it's kind of like a dream. It's like I don't even remember. Some almost feels like I was never there. But if I didn't have this MISA, at least I know I was there, because we just live in such a different society up here in the United States. I mean, it's a beautiful country we live in the United States, but the society, the culture here is so not magical, um, which makes it very difficult to come back to after you've had your life transformed. It's very difficult to come back to a anesthetized culture that looks to anesthetize itself with drugs and alcohol and anything else, any other distraction, to distort themselves from whatever pain they're in. And because, you know, we've pretty much stripped all of the magic from this country. But I'm hoping that we'll reconnect again with the land so that we can re-experience the magic again of nature spirits and being connected to the land. But at the time I came back, I was very depressed because I just felt like, the whole world had opened up to me. And then I came home and it just disappeared again. And that was really, it still is painful when I think about it. And I was really lucky that I was shown the tobacco spirit while I was here in Florida, because I felt like it was the one thing I could do that would make me feel like the magic wasn't gone. And also the healing, obviously, is enormous. And it gave me a huge tool and a huge ally. It's not just a tool, it's an ally, it's a plant spirit ally. And it was kind of the beginning of me feeling like, okay, maybe I can keep this going. Maybe I can keep this this way of being going, so that I don't anesthetize myself into, absolute depression again, or whatever, whatever else would happen. And so 3 or 4 years passed by, and I was doing regular tobacco ceremonies, both by myself and with my family, and prayers and such. And some really great things were happening, and it was also helping me through some really tough times too, like some really difficult things were happening too. Um, Things that made me kind of lose faith in humanity for a little bit there, especially people I thought were my friends, people that didn't really help me out very much at the time. And then, I found out there were some other people that did help me out. So it was kind of nice, because I was going through a really hard time. And then when things settled down a little bit, I I just started racking my brain and asking the spirits over and over and over, you know, what was the point of me going to Peru if I'm not going to use this knowledge or this wisdom? I mean, I'm using it on myself. Um, I can pray with my misa, and I can, now at that point I had been practicing with tobacco for a few years. I've learned this, I'm really fortunate to have been shown these things. But like, what was the point? Like, because I just thought in my head, oh, I go to Peru, that means I'm going to get into Andean shamanism full time, or even part time, or it's going to be part of my you know what I do, my purpose, you know. And there was a few days where I was really almost talking out loud with this stuff, and the place that I live now has been very enchanted in a good way. And that's when this was happening. But this was almost like 10 years ago when this happened. And I remember I had started seeing some really cool stuff. Maybe next time I'll talk about that. Uh, in nature, especially, and feeling the spirits in this place here. And it was just really neat. And I remember, once again, having a difficult time, but also having some really positive things happen at the same time. But I remember I kept saying out loud, I was like, why did this happen? Why did I do this? I'm glad I did it, but I don't understand. Why is this happening? And I heard this very strong voice say, you had to go to Peru to find out who your ancestors were and are. And I was like, I'll never forget that. And I was like, oh, okay. I'm not from Peru, obviously. And, well, maybe not so obvious, but I'm not. And yet I had to go there to find out who my ancestors were and are. So maybe I'll try and pick up with that next time. But um, that's it for today. Okay.